All right. Welcome everybody to our University of Minnesota Agrivoltaics webinar series. We're in our third installment of this year, so we're really excited about that to keep the ball rolling. We took a break here in June, but we are back in July with um, two talented and experts in solar development. We have Angela Burke and Mike Delagalla as well. And we're really excited to hear their varying perspectives on integrating agriculture under solar panels, also known as agrivoltaics. And we're hoping that you have brought your questions along with you tonight and are ready to engage in a wonderful discussion on how we get these two systems working together. So, if you haven't heard, I'm Sabrina Florentino. Often I forget to introduce myself, but I work here at the University of Minnesota for Extension and in alternative livestock systems as an educator. And one of those alternative systems we would call agrivoltaics. And I work a lot with Dr. Brad Hines, who has a number of different research projects going on here in Minnesota at the West Central Research and Outreach Center, which is where we have started this journey and are hoping to bring the information from both research and practice to you all through this webinar series. But with no further ado, as I've already mentioned, we have Mike Delagalla and Angie Burke presenting for us. And I'm going to have Mike pull up his slide now as I introduce him. Mike is the founder and CEO of Solar Collective and has been in the solar industry since 2009. He founded the Solar Collective Agrivoltaics in 2021, which exclusively develops dual-use agrivoltaic projects in the Northeast. Solar Collective believes in a farmer-first approach to developing dual-use projects on egg production and focuses on egg production and farm planning ahead of solar development. Solar Collective is currently developing over 30 agrivoltaic projects in Massachusetts and is leading the adoption of agrivoltaics in Connecticut. All Solar Collective's projects are on existing small-scale family farm commercial egg operations. So we're really excited to hear more about this concept and endeavor that Mike and his team have been working on. So Mike, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Very happy to be here. Thanks for having us. Um, so I really just have this one slide, which I think says a lot about what we're doing, and Sabrina did a nice job of recapping our approach here. So our objective is to focus on saving active farms. So we are, as you can see here, exclusively in Massachusetts at the moment. We did just introduce legislation to the Connecticut legislature in the 2020 sixth session, and we did get something passed, and it had bipartisan support, so we're pleased with that. The approach here is that the program or the incentive program, what's meant to be actionable by January of 2027, is now being studied by the Connecticut Department of Ag and Department of Energy, and so they have gone to the stakeholders and they're asking for some feedback. So whatever happens, we're looking forward to an actionable market, like I said, starting in January of 2027. But it's exciting when a new state joins the ranks of an incentive program that is focused on saving farms. So it fits right into what we're doing. We're obviously staying small and local in New England. And the farm size, the demographic is very, very similar. The average farm size in Massachusetts is about 75 acres, same in Connecticut. And so we do focus on the smaller side of development. So we will not build typically anything larger than 7 or so acres, which is about a megawatt and a half. And irrespective of farm size, but typically, like I said, based on 7.5 acres, that's just under 10% of the average farm size. And so our objective is to use as little land as possible, but have as big as impact as possible, as you can see in our clever slide. The idea is to using 10% of the land to increase revenue by more than 50%. And we can do that in places like Connecticut and Massachusetts because electricity is very expensive. And so when we do sell that electricity, there's plenty of revenue to then go back into the farm. And our economic goal there is to pay the farmer the real estate value, today's real estate value on a per acre basis every year for 20 years. And we feel like that's a compelling story that helps with farmer adoption. Average farmers making about 1,000, or in Massachusetts, about $1,000 an acre. And the real estate value is about $15,000 an acre. So our goal is to pay $15,000 an acre every year for 20 years. And that's a compelling story when faced with uh, real estate development for, one thing or another, but basically taking the farm out of production. Um, like I said, we focus on small, and we do focus on a fair bit of different types of ag, as you can see here. So blue is dairy, um, then veggie, and then that's a round hay bale, if you can't tell. So 14 of those, and then the red is actually cranberry. That's an interesting application and unique to Massachusetts. And then grazing is the light blue. So we design these systems to fit into existing ag practices. As you can imagine, what we do on a cranberry bog is not exactly what we do in a hayfield, or what we do at a dairy farm, or what we do at a veggie farm. And all these things are kind of bespoke. They are meant to keep the current ag practice in practice going forward. And so we try to build around whatever machinery is being used, whatever shade light ratio the farmer thinks he or she needs, availability to the site, whether there's a fence or there's not a fence. So all these things come into play, and we try to use that or do that rather from a farmer first approach. You tell us what you're doing on this site. We'll tell you what we think fits for a design, and then we'll work on it together to say, is this enough of sun? Is this enough shade? Is this enough room for you to fit your tractor with implements? Do you need more space? So that's how we start. And we usually end up with a design that fits the current ag practices. And then that also gives us comfort that this can continue going forward, that the farmer is comfortable with it, that they think they can produce year after year for 20 years under this program, that the state is okay with this because they have a lot to do with obviously running incentives and making sure that we are doing right by their incentives, and that we are keeping farms in business, which is kind of the point of the entire thing. So that's kind of all I had. I look forward to discussion with the group and any questions that the webinar might have.
Thank you, Mike. Maybe before we move on, could you
Sure.
just give us some more insight into what that process looks like when working with a farmer? How long is that planning process? And with that, do you think the concept that you have created is replicable in other spots in the country?
The
Maybe
last
a
question
loaded
first,
question.
yes. Yeah, for sure. And I think Angie probably has some more insight on things outside the country, or outside the state. So I think this is certainly scalable in other places. And speaking of scale, just for anybody who's from Minnesota on the webinar, Polk County is your largest rural county with 1.1 million farmland acres. Massachusetts and Connecticut combined are less than that in one county in Minnesota. So scale is relative. So yes, this can happen anywhere, and I think that the development, or the community focus with the farmer and the developer is the key to this, no matter where you're going to do this, whether it's in Connecticut or Massachusetts or Minnesota. Um, how we arrive at that, the easiest thing to do is actually get the developer or get the farmer to understand what we're trying to do, and we understand what they're trying to do. The hardest part about any solar project is actually getting it permitted and all the other stuff that has to go with solar. But the actual communication with the farmer and say, this is how much we're going to pay you. This is where we think this could go. Where do you think it should go? And how would you like this to work? What machinery do you need for it to work within this construct? And that part's actually pretty easy because they know what they need, and we really just listen to them because we're not farmers. We don't know exactly what they need. So when they tell us this is how it's going to work for them, we believe them. And then we kind of backfill all that and go to the state and say, this is what the plan is. Here is our development plan for you from an incentive perspective. And do you approve this plan? And then we have to do all the regular old solar stuff. which is certainly the hardest part of any of this. So actually working with the farmers is the easiest part. So from that perspective, it's certainly scalable across the country.
Thank you, Mike. I have lots more questions, but I think we'll bring in Angie here and then we can get both of you to answer those questions towards the end. Um, so, Angie, if you want to pull up your slides, and I'll introduce you with 15 years of experience in solar and storage. Angie Burke specializes in creating dual-use environments where renewable energy assets coexist with active farming operations. Under her leadership, Pivot Energy has successfully implemented sheep grazing on over 95% of its solar projects, an achievement that contributed to Burke's recognition as the 2024 North American Agrivoltaics Champion of the Year. Angie's background in architecture and technical design allows her to oversee the strategic engineering required to ensure solar infrastructure supports rather than hinders farming activities. She is a leader in the agrivoltaic space. Her model demonstrates how agrivoltaics can be a scalable solution that maintains agricultural traditions while achieving modern sustainability goals. So we're excited to hear now from Pivot Energy's perspective what keeping the farm in solar farm looks like.
Great. Thank you, Sabrina. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I'm very grateful to be here and be able to share some perspectives and some experience from Pivot Energy over the years here. And, especially grateful that I get to now hold the title of Director of Land Stewardship, which is really fantastic. I get to focus on everything beneath the panels all day, every day in my job role, which is really just so exciting. But in that role here at Pivot Energy, to step back, Pivot Energy was founded in 2009. So we have over 15 years of total solar experience under our belts. And we work that solar project from the very beginning all the way through operations and eventual decommissioning of a site. So we develop, manage construction, and then own and operate distributed generation scale solar and battery storage assets. These are a lot of kind of bragawatt numbers down here, but I think what's really impactful is that we're not just building solar energy generation facilities. We're also really dedicated to integrating in and supporting the communities where our plants are operating. And so to date, we have donated over $2.2 million to hyper-local nonprofit and other organizations that are directly impacted positively from our projects. Those projects range in geography. We kind of operate coast to coast, we have developed and built projects coast to coast. We currently, of our owned assets, we're operating in about a dozen states, give or take. And let's see, within that, as much as there's a big kind of geographic spread for our projects over time here, we are all in that distributed generation scale. So as a little different from Mike's project sites, our projects are typically about 5 megawatts per site that we're talking about. And that is equivalent to about 25 to 30 acres per site. Back to that community investment piece, again, I mentioned that those donations and reinvestments that we've made in these communities. And we also are engaging further in those communities too, including site tours. We're hosting interns every summer now, which is really exciting. We are sponsoring scholarships and really working specifically through these sort of investment pillars as we're making those decisions and engaging in those communities. So, it's always interesting and exciting to me that we're contributing to workforce development in these rural communities. We're also reducing energy burden, specifically for low income or income qualified households through our community solar bill credits. But then we're also really focusing in on agriculturally focused initiatives and kind of economic programming that supports farmers and landowners and others beyond kind of the project boundaries. And that is kind of where I step in and where I play a big role for Pivot's programmatic approach to land stewardship. For us, we are essentially committed to deploying dual use or agrivoltaics on 100% of our qualified project sites. So it can be a little difficult to have sheep grazing on a rooftop, and we do develop rooftop sites. But essentially, anything that is non-rooftop, so every single ground mount site that we have, we're deploying some type of dual use or agrivoltaics there. And for us, that again matters because it really aligns with that community investment ethos that we have. It's also really aligned with the fact that we're a B corporation. And so we have a commitment to people, profit, and planet. And we really have to, show to our shareholders and to our board of directors that we're providing positive impact. Also, though, at the end of the day, doing dual use and agrivoltaics on site, it's a really smart business decision. This type of configuration for us at scale on 100% of qualified sites, it pencils for both us and the landowners and the farm partners that we engage with. And so we really view this as an imperative in our business operations. Our approach to actually implement and integrate on every qualified site is essentially kind of working through a bit of a decision tree where we begin with livestock grazing as our standard baseline and our default assumption on every project site. And then from there, if livestock grazing is not allowed or not able to be implemented for some reason, then we'll go down the list to either ecosystem services or true crop production on a site. Now, since solar grazing is our default and baseline assumption, we currently have active solar sheep grazing on about 95% of our project sites. And the way that we approach that and implement that at such a scale is by just integrating it through our vegetation management services agreement. So this is a contract that we, as the independent power producer or IPP, we enter into that contract with a local grazing partner. And that grazing partner, we find them through a variety of different avenues, but essentially we are compensating them on a per acre per year basis because this is truly providing a service for us that we would otherwise have to spend these dollars for mechanical mowing services. But I think in our early days of kind of shifting to hold solar assets long term and be that owner throughout the life cycle, we really saw this as an opportunity to not just use mechanical mowing just for the sake of compliance and keeping the panels from being shaded. This was a huge opportunity to really engage with farmers and truly leave the land better than we found it. And these sheep do a really great job of being our landscapers every growing season. And they're depositing that great brown fertilizer into the soil that's really kind of enriching the land. And again, leaving it better than we found it. This is just a great example photo, an example of a project site. This is in Kankakee, Illinois. This is a site where we worked really closely with our farm partner and got really creative and kind of split some budget across a few project sites to help offset an additional cost they had to grow their operations. And so we helped to kind of sponsor some funds for them to essentially buy an additional kind of pop-up trailer. I can't remember what it's called really. I am so not a farmer. But it was a kind of over the top of your like truck bed to be able to carry just a few sheep at a time to take them to the vet or to run them back and forth to a different site or something. So that was just a really proud moment for us last year to get creative and find where we had maybe potentially room in our budgets that we could spend this wisely in a way to support this grazer to continue to grow with us as we grow. As far as solar grazing is concerned for landowners who might be interested, this admittedly is a few and far between situation in my experience. So whereas Mike is always starting with farmers who want to continue producing on the land, for Pivot Energy, I would say about 90% of the time, our landowners really don't have a desire to continue producing on their parcel. And they're really engaging with solar rather as a way to keep that farmland owned by their family, but it's a great like option for them as they're entering retirement or this or that kind of like different phase of life. And so this is, again, few and far between for me, but we will often include a first right of refusal in our lease language for our landowners if they're interested in grazing the site, or if they have a nephew, cousin, sister, or someone else that they want to work with to graze on the site. If that landowner is interested, we'll give them that contract grazing template up front and have them review that and kind of start to suss out any terms and conditions that might give them heartburn as we negotiate the lease later in the process. And then I really encourage those landowners to also evaluate what are those compensation rates, what's kind of, the going market rate in your area, what are your insurance requirements and coverage costs going to look like? Are you going to spin off a separate LLC or operate this under your existing ag entity that you have? So those are, kind of great ways for us to learn alongside with that landowner and kind of vet together, is this a good fit for you to do grazing on the site long term? And then other than that, separate from Pivot Energy, I always encourage our landowners and other folks to check out the American Solar Grazing Association and explore their certified solar grazing training program. I think that goes a really long way in kind of giving a good rounded kind of 101 education on what it takes to provide solar grazing as a service. Now, as I mentioned, grazing and livestock is not always going to be allowed on our project sites. We will occasionally have situations where a local jurisdiction disallows livestock, or there could be an existing site condition that is such that we don't feel comfortable deploying livestock on the site. And in those cases, in those scenarios, we are going to then move down our decision tree to ecosystem services. That's a simple 2 words, but it means a wide variety of different configurations that we can deploy on a site. Depending on, kind of the landowner's goals, Pivot Energy's goals, what are the true conditions, what's going to grow or not on the site, we'll kind of work through this and a longer list to determine which options work best for an ecosystem services setup here. So that could look like things like soil amendments, soil health monitoring, really focusing in on that dirt below the panels. It could be research initiatives partnered with a local college or university or other group. It could look like hosting a beekeeper, hosting an apiary on the site and having bee colonies and educational experiences and other activities like that. It could also be pollinator-friendly seed mixes. I'm looking more and more at integrating milkweed, especially around the perimeter of our project sites that are in that monarch butterfly migration path. So I think we can get really creative there as well. And finally, other interesting and unique characteristics of a solar project can really be beneficial for endangered or at-risk species. So I just mentioned the monarch, but these solar projects are also a really great habitat area for ground nesting birds. And Pivot Energy has previously engaged with a nonprofit group to essentially raise and release quail and pheasant on project sites, because this makes a really great kind of predator-proof or nearly predator-proof space for them to be laying their eggs and nesting. So this is a very long way to say ecosystem services can look a multitude of different ways. I'm especially proud, though, of this project site in Aurora, Colorado, where our beekeeper, Brian, has 20 bee colonies on site and makes lots of very delicious solar honey every year. And we also engage with Brian to do 2 educational events for us each year on the project site. And that is, again, a really great way for us not just to have honey production and just ecosystem services on site. We can kind of continue that community engagement beyond just those permitting phases and can continue to be a good presence in the local area. As far as landowner considerations for ecosystem services, so again, those cases where you can't necessarily have livestock on site. We're still going to need to think about mechanical mowing or other methods of vegetation management on site. And so when we're shifting over to an ecosystem services configuration, we are still going to be very mindful of cost and logistics and, how do we truly implement this on the project? And so if this is your kind of primary goal for the land or your primary interest in the dual use space, I would encourage you to speak up early and often with that solar developer and that solar owner to kind of express these preferences and specifically to share any and all of your contacts that you have related to those ecosystem goals that you have for your site. So, do you know a professor at a local college or university? Do you know someone at, your university extension office that you might introduce them to and get them, kind of started early phase on a research project? Do you have bees, or does your cousin, sister, friend have bees and you would like to have them hosted on the site? Do you work with a nonprofit, maybe as your day job, or there's just a great nonprofit in your area that you have good connections with and you want to see them involved? Any and all of these connections can be really helpful so that the earlier the better in that planning process, that solar developer can start to integrate exactly what these logistics, costs, and other considerations will be. Now, in a smaller subset of sites for us at Pivot Energy is where we have employed crop production on site. So for Pivot, we do approach this a little differently than how Mike's group does. So we're approaching all of our project sites really as solar production first and evaluating if and how we can make minimal tweaks to design in order to enable cropping on the site. So I'm not sure I would consider a cranberry bog, Mike, but we have successfully had a few projects where we're doing hay production. And those worked well because we could really minimally tweak our row spacing and our row height such that we stayed in that same steel category cost-wise and basically switched to just a different racking manufacturer. So we didn't have drive shafts kind of breaking up the aisleways. And then if as long as we can make those minimal tweaks and use existing farm equipment and kind of, just edge our perimeter fencing slightly for turnaround radius, as long as we can make those minimal design tweaks, then we can enable cropping on our sites. This is one example of a site where we have enabled crop production between the rows, just to give it kind of that like physical feel of what this looks like scale wise. So this is a site in Greeley, Colorado. And we essentially increased our minimum post height by about 6 inches, give or take, and increased our row spacing also by 6 inches. So pretty minimal. I mean, over the course of 30 acres or so, yes, that spacing has a bit of impact, but in this case, the parcel was a total of about 50 acres. So we did have that wiggle room to work with. So as you can see, I mean, Tom right here is disking the site and prepping it for seeding. And this is an existing tractor and disc that he already had kind of in his usual operations. And these panels are nearly at full tilt. So that's almost the kind of minimum ground clearance between the panel and the ground. And you can see this fits pretty comfortably and it works well. And this year we are in our second year of production, so stay tuned for more videos. Hopefully I'll be up there for some cutting and baling coming soon here. But if you are a landowner specifically interested in crop production on site, again, you can do first right of refusal in your lease for the veg management. There could be a negotiation point on your lease compensation rate, especially if you have to accommodate more kind of robust design tweaks to accommodate your cropping. You should probably also ask to consult to some extent on those design considerations and what that ultimate cropping plan is to make sure you're really working hand in hand with that developer and ultimate long-term owner there. Um, Definitely talk about pre-seeding, compaction considerations, overseeding, etc. And again, I encourage folks to go elsewhere. You don't have to hear it just from me. You can check out AgriSolar Clearinghouse is a really great resource for tons of different agrivoltaics related research. And then there's plenty of guides and fact sheets and kind of best practices FAQs for landowners out there. And honestly, Mike is probably a great resource here as well. So we'll start with asking him questions. Um, and yeah, this is just kind of in closing. I just wanted to state again that, agrivoltaics at especially that distributed generation or community solar scale, I think it works really well. And I think Pivot Energy has really proven out the thought or the kind of question that I posed of can we truly do this at scale in terms of, dozens and hundreds of projects. And yeah, really, really proud that today we have sheep this year grazing on 72 projects across the country. Next year, that number is going to nearly double, and we're just kind of more and more upside from there. Here is my contact information. Y'all are welcome to jot it down, or if you want to reach out afterwards on LinkedIn or otherwise, I'm happy to chat anytime. And then final plug for our pro bono legal program that we offer. So this is for landowners and or farmers who are pursuing hosting a renewable energy project or becoming like a solar farmer or a solar grazer. We are very careful that this is kind of separate from our day to day, but we have really fantastic lawyers that are at the ready to volunteer their time to support you with your legal needs. And I will kick it back to Sabrina. I think you probably have a better slide than that while folks start asking questions.
I think we'll keep it on our faces now for this chat, but thank you, Angie, for giving us a rundown of Pivot's approach and actually particular to the legal help. Does that have to be someone involved with Pivot's projects, or it could be anybody in
No,
the realm?
prefer that they're
They're
not
not a
involved in the
perfect.
project.
Okay,
So we've supported folks like in Tennessee, which is just not a market that we operate in. So reach out. It's worth gut checking and asking. If we do feel there's a conflict of interest, we'll message that and kind of try and point you in another direction. But yeah, really open to any landowner or farmer who's pursuing this.
perfect. Thanks for that clarification. I think it would be useful if we took a step back. One of the questions is about, who owns all of the different moving pieces of these projects, and I think that is one point that can get pretty confusing for myself and for any other producer of, what's the difference between the solar developer, the landowner, and, who owns the project long term and whether it's the solar development company or not. In both of your scenarios, what does that look like? And maybe leading into decommissioning, what does that look like as well? If you touch on all those pieces.
Mike, you go first. I need more water.
We own and operate the solar equipment, and we lease that land from the farmer. So, when I guess that wasn't clear. So when I said, we want to pay the landowner, X dollars per year per acre, that is in form of a lease payment. So that is our goal. That owning and operating and leasing the land from them is extremely helpful for both parties. There's certainly some back and forth as to how that works. Typically, in a old school, let's call it traditional ground mount, there's a fence, and you lease land or you own land, and nobody's allowed to go inside that fence, and that's it. You go in for your O&M purposes, and otherwise that thing is locked and probably 8 to 10 feet tall, potentially with barbed wire, right? So it is off limits. now, obviously, the entire purpose of these arrays is that there is unfettered access for the farmer or for the livestock or whatever is happening. So there's certainly a lot of, and that's why we get this we get on board with our farmers early on to not only understand the design that's going to work for them, but the accessibility that's going to work for them. Like when are they in season? When are they using this type of equipment? When are they using that type of equipment? When do we need to be there? All that stuff gets, coordinated early on, and we try to stick to, I mean, look, things move in the schedule for both us and them, but the idea is like here, seasonality, this is what they're doing, here, this is what we're doing. And it works pretty well, pretty seamlessly, most of the time. So, and there are certainly times where we won't do any kind of, we certainly don't do scheduled O&M during their busy season. Obviously, there's an emergency, we can call and make sure that we can or cannot do that. But there's a lot of coordination going in. And then regarding decommissioning, same type of thing. The idea is that this is still effective long past the initial lease term. That the soil health is still improving over time, and ag yield is still improving over time, and this is working for the farmer and it's working for us as the equipment owner. We would want to continue on, but we do, and actually Massachusetts requires at the state level that each municipality require a decommissioning bond from a solar developer, whether agrivoltaics or traditional ground mount solar, to be posted at some point in time so that if we disappear or whatever, and it's year 21, farmers had enough, or just the regular landowners had enough, they can go into an escrow account, pull that out, and there's cash for them to pay somebody to remove it. But again, we think that that's kind of like a worst case scenario.
Yeah, so pretty similar structure for Pivot Energy, where we are that developer who's initially designing and kind of permitting and getting that project ready. And then we are the long-term owner operator as well. So we're there kind of from day zero all the way through to the end of the useful solar life. Um, so yeah, really similar structure. So that means that we own all of the solar equipment, everything above and below ground, the fencing around the property, around the solar project, all of the solar infrastructure is wholly owned by Pivot Energy. The land, though, and the actual parcel is still owned by the landowner that we have engaged with, and we're leasing that land from them. As far as decommissioning, yeah, just like Mike said, we essentially, in most every case, most every state, sometimes there's variance, but there's usually going to be a decommissioning bond posted with that local jurisdiction. And so those are monies that are set aside up front during that permitting and development phase, that are essentially sitting there and waiting to be used at the end of that useful life in order to remove those system components. So whether or not Pivot ends up owning the solar project all the way through those years, there's still money there. So that's kind of that peace of mind in the what if scenario of a solar asset owner, changing hands or something like that.
And then a quick one for you, Angie. What could you say more about a B Corp and what that means?
Yeah, so B Corporation is essentially a different, let's see, it's a third party kind of verification or certification program, that certifies that as a business that we are kind of equally prioritizing people, profit, and planet. So it's not necessarily a different business structure or varying from your LLC or corporation kind of designation. It's rather that third party that's saying, yes, Pivot Energy does business in a responsible way that is supportive and, kind of environmentally friendly. They're good to their people and their communities where they operate. So yeah, it's a third party certification. There's a lot of great companies out there like Bombas Socks, a lot of other companies that are also B Corps.
Thanks for that background. I was wondering if we could touch on, so in Mike's situation, where looking at what the farmer is already doing and designing the solar site to fit that. So for Mike, what usually is like the motivation for those farmers to get into solar? Um, what does that conversation look like in the beginning? And then Angie, maybe you could talk a little bit about why you go with grazing first, and maybe touch on what those farmers, you said maybe they're retiring or what have you, why they're not interested in farming anymore.
Yeah, so working with active farms and active farmers is certainly our objective. And in doing that, our conversation is pretty easy. Their motivation is like everybody else in ag. It's tough, right? Inputs are going up, prices are going down, and how do they save the farm? They are stewards of the land. They are Most of my farmers don't think that this is their land. They're just stewarding it for this is just their turn to steward the land for the next generation, as those for them. So they have a deep tie to land and they want to keep it in the family, whether there's a succession plan. And this stuff helps for succession planning. But the idea is it's mostly economically based. I don't think any farmer raises their hand and said, I want to all of a sudden farm in an obstacle course. So they're economically motivated, and that's why we want to touch as little of their existing land as possible, but pay them as much so that they are not compelled to talk to a real estate developer who wants to do whatever. So a place like Massachusetts, just to give you an idea, like the farthest point away from Massachusetts or farthest point away from Boston and Massachusetts is only like 3 hours. So it's a very small space. So like urban sprawl is pretty real. And so a lot of places a lot of farms that we talk to that are in the eastern part of the state, I mean, real estate development pushing out into their part of the state is a very, very real issue. And so how do they maintain their active ag land around that movement? And the answer is typically money, right? So how do I continue to do my what I'm doing today and what I've done for generations before while maintaining this land and kind of on a fixed income, if not a declining income? Like I said, as inputs go up and prices are held steady or going down, it's really, really tough to make a living. So this is an easy way for them to do that, not in addition, and not only just the money that they get from our lease payments to them, which is substantial, but they are looking to reinvest that into the farm. Whether they're trying to convert that parcel or another parcel from conventional to organic or regenerative, they now have the time and the money to do that. They also have the time to take a swing at maybe a couple of other crops or types of strategies that they haven't had the time or the money to implement before. Uh, because I mean, as if when money is tight, if you take a swing and you miss, it's tough, right? You get another one of my farmer friends says you get to do that once, you don't get to do that twice. So this allows them the breathing room to make decisions. So like maybe we have one guy who has a few acres that he's let grown over because he couldn't afford to farm them. And so now he has the capital to go back and turn that back into active ag production income generating parcel that hasn't been for last 15 or 20 years. So it's kind of like the compounding effect of what this income does for them. And so that's their entire motivation is keeping the farm on their watch, keeping it for the next generation. Like I said, nobody wants to be the guy who sold the family farm. So or the gal who sold the family farm. So yeah, that's their entire motivation.
Thanks. And Sabrina, could you repeat the question for my side?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned that grazing is usually the priority or the first stop, and if you could touch on why that is, and also, um, is most of the farmers, are they retiring, or what are their motivations for saying, I'm not going to do this anymore?
Thank you for the reminder. So yeah, grazing as our baseline and starting point really has to do with the economics. So sheep grazing specifically, as compared to mechanical mowing, is either cost competitive or cost savings. And so across every state, every market, and I'm talking from Hawaii to Colorado to Illinois to New York, it just makes sense and pencils for us. And it pencils for the farm partner as well, ultimately, because this is, paid additional access to additional acreage. And it pencils all around, and we don't have to stray from our standard design specs. And so we found that, being careful about wire management, raising panels to 36 instead of 30 inches, but from grade as our standard, that really didn't affect the economics of the solar project, and thus we can commit to that standard and kind of have that longevity view of operating the site in a responsible way. And also in the meantime, over the years, we've met lots of sheep farmers across the country that are really excited to have additional acreage and additional production and kind of, overall additional protein source for Americans that is US raised. And so I think that's an exciting opportunity for growth for an ag industry that has been in decline over multiple decades. Um, as far as our landowners, though, not engaging in grazing or not engaging on continued production on the site, most of that has to do with them aging out. The typical or the average age of a farmer in the US is, I think, 62 and a half years old. So many of those folks are just not wanting to physically work that land anymore. And in the meantime, the next generation has moved away to bigger cities. They've moved on to different career paths and different choices they've made that are not bringing them back to the farm. And so leasing the farm to a solar company is a way to, again, like Mike mentioned, that succession planning of keeping the parcel in the land and in that family name for the next generation after that, the grandkids or the great grandkids. Um, and then again, also it's a tough market. Fuel prices are going up, labor prices, fertilizer, seed, everything is just going up, up, up. And so it's also tough to make a buck farming, even if they continue leasing the land to a farm partner. It's really hard to make that pencil. So solar offers a good solution.
Angie, have you run into any situations where you don't have sheep producers nearby, that it just doesn't work out to solar graze with sheep? And of course, my background, I'm biased. Well, I own sheep as well, but I have a passion for cattle. We do have a question in the chat of, what does it look like to get cattle under panels? And maybe Mike, you can talk on those site design modifications. But Angie, yeah, have you run into those situations?
Yeah, if we can't find a sheep farmer, um, I will start with ASGA, the American Solar Grazing Association, and their kind of map of members. And if there isn't coverage there, then my second stop is a group called United Agrivoltaics. And they essentially act as kind of a farmers cooperative for sheep producers across the country. And so they've been super helpful in kind of different or new markets where I couldn't find a producer. They were able to tee that up, give them some educational resources, and get them on the solar site.
So specifically regarding cattle and site design, obviously we need a little more space than for sheep, and it also depends on what type of cows you have. So um, we are typically in the 6+ foot range. I mean, everything we do is 6 feet and taller. So depending on so for row crops, and again, this comes into shading analysis. So how far apart are the rows? That has to do with not only can your equipment fit through there, what is the shading analysis like when you have wide open space, right? So that comes into it a lot, and then height has a lot to do with that as well. And we typically build on trackers so that the clip that Angie showed before, they said they were at full tilt, so you saw that close to the ground, there was still plenty of room for that tractor to move in. So all that comes into account when you're just grazing and there's no other equipment. Now you're really just doing shade analysis. I'm just make sure that there's enough of like a microclimate ecosystem for the grass to grow and enough space for cattle to move around safely. Like if you're not haying that field, it's pretty easy, but it's still at like 6 feet, I would say, maybe even a bit more, depending on what the tilt, like the final tilt of that panel is, because that can sometimes be depending on the height of your when flat, right? If you're at flat at 6 feet and your tilt is probably inside of 3 feet, what kind of cattle are you grazing? Is that dangerous for them? Sharp corners, maybe they like them, maybe they don't like them, I guess, but it depends on, right? So all that stuff comes into play, like in what the current practices are. But yeah, there's a little more analysis to it. There's a little more cost. So the C channels that you see behind Angie right there, not cheap. And the taller they are, the more they cost, right? And also the taller they are, the farther embedded into the ground they need to go. And there's a lot of wind in Massachusetts. So all these things come into play. But if you start with the farmer, understand what they need, what they're doing on site, how much room and space are they comfortable with their cows having. We kind of come back with a design and say, well, what do you think about this, right? And we kind of just go from there. So yeah, it's an iterative process, and I don't really have like a firm answer. Like we always do 7 feet, but it's something like that.
Along with those design modifications and site construction, is there soil health is really important. So is there any consideration for how that land is impacted
Uh,
with
Absolutely,
construction, what that
for
looks
sure.
like,
Yeah,
your process?
absolutely.
Could you share on that?
Yeah, I mean, particularly with cranberry bog. So I didn't know this until I started working with cranberry growers. So cranberry is just it's dry sand for 363 days a year, and then it's flooded to corral the fruit and during harvest. So the vines grow on the ground. So obviously construction happens on the ground. So how do we preserve the fruit, which is pretty sensitive? So we lay down mats that protect the fruit. We sometimes try to do this in the winter where we can release a little bit of water and put a cover of ice on top of the vines that are on the ground and then build on top of that, kind of get like our own natural mat. That's an example in cranberry bogs. We will also do some sort of like mat. Usually it's just like a hay mat, depending on like where we are, the application. I mean, application like what type of ag and soil. But yeah, we soil preservation is the key to this entire thing because our objective is to for our farmers not to miss a season. So we come in as quickly as we can after they are done with their harvest, get that built. And Massachusetts not dissimilar from Minnesota regarding winters and the time that you actually like the buildable season. So we try to hustle and get that done so that we are not impacting A, their business practice, and B, their soil maintenance. But yeah, we take care to make sure that we are doing everything to preserve the soil. And then if we're putting something back and what type of, and if we are reseeding, what did they have there before? What do they want there now? And so everything goes back to what did it look like the minute before we got there, and that's what should look like when we leave.
Yeah, I'll just add that, civil works or like cut and fill like grading activities. I think if a project site has some very terrain or topography, the assumption might be that you need to flatten it out and perfect it for the solar, but really just where we are technology wise today with trackers and different racking manufacturers, that's really not the case. I
Yeah,
see a
that's a good
lot
point.
of variation on our post heights, and we really prioritize not cutting and filling because
Yeah,
that topsoil is
yeah.
black gold, right?
Yep.
Like we
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 don't
don't
do
want to
any
mess with
grubbing
it.
or grading either. Yeah. If there's a 15% slope, we build on a 15% slope. Like that's it. So that and then like I said, mats and for additional coverage, just because obviously like we try to drive in tractor lanes, right? So if you have row croppers, that stuff is already there. Can we drive into tractor lanes and use equipment to deploy and drive piles from an existing tractor lane so we're not on the crops?
And traditionally, there has been a lot of pushback against solar in rural and agricultural communities. One of the questions is, have you experienced that? Where has the pushback come from? If you have, what has that experience been for you? And, you touched on one thing that the technology has changed and we aren't, destroying soil in the process likely, but what does that look like for you? Any pushback you've received?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty commonly echoed sentiment that solar is removing agricultural land from agricultural production. I think dual use or agrivoltaics really just kind of neutralizes that sentiment or assumption or argument that's kind of out there in the zeitgeist. I think, there's also a resource, I'll go find it and drop it in the chat, but when you really look at the total land area that we're talking about for solar compared to golf courses and compared to our total prime farmland in the country, it's really, really very nominal that we're talking about and that we're projected to, host solar arrays on. And so yeah, I can see the assumption and the pushback, and it just is really nullified when you think about dual use and about the kind of bigger picture of total acreages.
Yeah, we see a fair bit of it as well, and I think our application is different, right? So we're literally not changing anything that's happening on the farm, except, listen, it's solar panels are not good looking, right? But the farm stays in ag production. That still hasn't really hit, to be honest with you. The local community, our hyper local community, where if we're building, and there are neighbors within a view shed, they usually have a relationship with that farmer. Their parents have had a relationship with that farmer or that farmer's parents, and like they've all been in that neighborhood for, you know, 50, 100 years. That the immediate neighborhood is very, very easy to manage because those are really good relationships. These people have known each other for a long time, and that's fine. It's kind of the township open mic kind of town hall meetings where people can come and display displeasure, and it always comes down to you're taking farmland out of production, and it's even when you tell them that you're not, that hasn't hit yet. So I think this is probably still new, right, in the grand scheme of solar. Or if you're going to do this, I don't believe it's going to work. My answer is, well, the farmer thinks it's going to work, and so he or she knows more than we do. So that we kind of leave it up to them. So, but yeah, it is not as easy as you think, and so I don't know. I would imagine that Angel's application might be a little more difficult, right? But even if you're just like, we're trying to be, I would like to say seen and not heard, but you can't miss a solar array. But we're trying to have as little impact as possible, and it's still an uphill battle from a permitting perspective.
Thank you both for those insights. There was a question, what percentage of your projects are community solar, and is that a recruitment tool that they are agrivoltaic sites?
For Pivot Energy, the vast majority of our projects are community solar gardens. So those local businesses or residences can subscribe to the sites. I would say thus far, the agrivoltaics isn't necessarily a boon for getting subscribers to sign up for the sites. Rather, I think for them, it mostly comes down to the affordability question and the, option to have no cost out of pocket, but be able to benefit from 10 or so percent of savings from this solar garden. That really seems to be the biggest driver.
We do not have any community solar projects. We're a little small for that scale. And we have the option in Massachusetts and then also in Connecticut to sell directly to the utility on a fixed rate long-term contract. And so, from an economic certainty perspective, that's much easier for us. And that's also how we can pay, the lease rates that we pay, right? So it's not just the economics, it's certainty of economics as well.
So then getting into a little more, or maybe it's circling back to site design, and there's some questions about, can those panels be vertical, just, for the time being that farming has to happen? And then along that same vein, what technology do we have to even like decrease panel size at this point?
Panel size kind of has stayed the same, but they've gotten far more efficient in the same footprint. So that is happening. So the footprint of your project could shrink and you still get the same amount of output. But I mean, and technology changes very, very quickly. I mean, you buy a panel today and it's obsolete in 6 to 12 months. So, I mean, maybe we'll have really powerful modules the size of a cell phone in 10 years or something. So, um, the what was the first part of the question regarding design?
Is it like feasible that they could be vertically
Yeah,
tilt
it can,
for
yes,
time being?
it is feasible. That can all be controlled remotely. Typically, we try to just do like broad strokes of like when do you need to be here and when do we not need to be here. But it tracks with the hours of the day. And so typically it makes sense that you can work around, like you can keep it at like high noon, so to speak, so when it's flat. So yeah, you can do that. We don't really make a habit of making it bespoke. The farmer doesn't really want to do that. We don't really want to do that. But there are certain times where we certainly can do that, or turn the system off for a period of time and let it sit flat and let them, do some stuff if there's an emergency on the site or we have an emergency. Yeah, there's certainly some flexibility in doing that.
Yeah, kind of similar approach for us. We would like the solar to just kind of operate as usual. And we're specifically choosing racking types that are such that you can manipulate one row independent of the rest. So eliminating that drive shaft is step one to be able to get a tractor end to end unencumbered. But then that racking shift also allows us then to manipulate each row so you can kind of open up the top in kind of a cathedral or harvest position, so that you're really maximizing that elbow room side to side for your tractors for whatever activity you need to do. So we rely on that much less frequently, but that is an option we can employ.
So then moving into thinking about neighbors around the site, there's some questions about are there any, windbreaks or concerns about noise from the inverters, any view shed things that you think of? What does that look like you're planning for the impacts to the surrounding community?
Um, we typically implement screening or install screening wherever we are. It again, I think it depends on the farm and it depends on the neighbors. But yeah, like there's no legislative requirement for screening. We want to be good neighbors. Our farmers typically want to be good neighbors. So yeah, we will certainly install screening where we can. We've not had any sound issues. Um, it's minimal, if anything. No one's complained, like either farmers or neighbors, about hearing stuff because I mean it's not doing anything at night. So during the day, there's not much happening.
Yeah, I've never gotten a noise complaint from a solar array. The racking when most of these projects today are single axis tracking. So those panels are moving with the sun throughout the day. And that will make a little click noise every 15 minutes or so throughout the day. But unless you're standing directly next to that row and right next to those solar panels, you're not going to notice that. So being, set back to the fence line and to your next property line and to your house, you're really never going to hear that solar array running. As far as view shed, pivot energy, we will install vegetative buffers in that kind of like screening zone when it's required in a jurisdiction. And we can occasionally, in certain cases, make exceptions and kind of add on vegetative screening, even when it's kind of above and beyond if it's not required by that local jurisdiction. So we are sensitive to those neighbors' concerns. Visual impact is usually number one on their list. And to make sure we're capturing those concerns, we have a minimum of 2 touch points with that direct immediate community as we're going through our permit phase. And well, it's really technically 3 touch points overall, but we host 2 community-based meetings to get that input and 2 cents from the neighbors. And I've seen that result in added vegetative screening or like scooting our access road to the site and scooting it over because it was going to hinder his farming activities because he was using a certain area a different way we didn't know about. So those types of inputs are really helpful and important to us.
There is a question if you are working with projects in Minnesota, and do you purchase any in-process projects that may be expiring soon for either of you? And Mike, we may know that answer, but
Yeah, I don't think I'm helpful for this one.
So let's see. We have 2 active projects in Minnesota. But as of today, it's not an active market where we're pursuing continued development efforts. That could change as political winds and policy winds change. But as of today, we're not focused on the state of Minnesota. But we do, on occasion, acquire projects from other developers. So if you have projects in other states that align with our current focus areas, then we can definitely consider those.
all right, everyone who's participating, yep, get your questions in now. This is our last call for additional questions. There is some questions about have you worked with beginning emerging farmers, vegetable producers in any of your scenarios? And then have you heard of or worked with anyone with poultry under solar panels? I know that it exists, but I don't know any details, so anyone can share.
Um, Beginning farmers for sure. We are actually working on a couple of sites where it's actually closer to what Angie's doing in terms of like this farmer is interested in allowing other people to farm on there. So we're building an array. He's keeping let's say like 90% of um uh his his land in ag production for himself, and he wants to lease not only to us but to beginning farmers. So we're leasing that land, and that beginning farmer is going to get to farm for free in and out around the array. So and they get to keep the profit of their crop. So we are trying to focus on beginning farmers. I think that's a really important part. Angie mentioned the average age of the farmer in the United States and how succession planning is struggling. So anybody who wants to get into this, we are more than happy to help them and give them a parcel to farm on for absolutely $0. Um, yeah, I don't. Was there another part of that,
Any
Sabrina?
experience with poultry?
Oh, right. No, but great idea. I mean, certainly works, right?
Yeah. I can round that out. I newly Pivot has a site where we're putting poultry there pretty much as we speak. I think it'll be interesting and exciting. They're essentially free range chickens going and eating their grubs and greens and everything else. I think my big kind of question mark for proving it out is just making sure we have good security for the birds and probably deploying like multiple chicken tractors, figuring out how often do you move them, etc. Specifically just so that we're mindful of birds of prey so that we don't have any loss of that poultry. But I mean, we've figured out chicken tractors. I'm certain we can make them move between the rows of the panels. So I'm excited to share more after we have a full season with that farmer.
Very good. I'm glad that you have started that experience with poultry producers, and we're excited to hear more. All right. Just a few last questions here, and then we'll have you, Mike and Angie, share your last parting words, but some questions on insurance costs. Are they a risk or a growing risk, specifically with severe weather?
Uh, Weather is relatively easily accounted for. Like force majeure damage in most insurance policies are pretty commonplace. I mentioned earlier we have a fair bit of high-speed winds, like over 100 miles an hour in Massachusetts, that we need to not only engineer for, but also insure against. I think our biggest insurance problem has nothing to do with the actual array itself. It's with the federal tax credit. So getting that part insured is a challenge. But yeah, the actual array itself, all this stuff is pretty standard. You do obviously you have to have a bit more insurance because you're sharing that site with a farmer and a piece of equipment. And you do have to have a bit more insurance from a weather perspective because you are 2 to 3 feet or 2 to 3 feet or 2 to 3 times higher than you are in a traditional ground mount. So that comes into play, but um, it's not so onerous that it's really impacting the project negatively.
Yeah, I'll just add that, for our portfolios, we also have that like diversity of geographies happening. And so that can kind of like de-risk that overall insurance profile across 20 sites that are across 6 states. That looks a lot different from 20 sites in, a specific high wind zone or something. So there's other ways to kind of package or kind of tranche your project such that it kind of lowers the heartburn level for the insurance agents.
Does it make sense for the farmer to subcontract work and maintain the general contractor role in developing a solar project that is oriented to farming? So, what are the disadvantages and advantages of the farmer playing various roles in these projects?
Um, I can say we give our farmers all the opportunity to wear whatever hat they want. Um, Typically none of them want to be a GC. It's not a glamorous job, but we do give them the opportunity to own and the system themselves. Right? So if we'll just develop it for them, if they want to own and operate it, we help them put together the financial package to bring to their local bank, or if they have the cash on hand, or whatever the case is. We are certainly happy to let them do that for sure. We've expanded the O&M role to include like they can do some pre-construction trenching, which is helpful for the project. If we're running line from inside the fence to outside the fence to the point of interconnection, that's on their property. If they want to dig a trench, we're happy to let them do that, and obviously they get paid for their work on that. Uh, but yeah, we'll let them do whatever they want, and most of the time it sounds like a good idea, and then by the time we're at our third or fourth meeting talking about the things that we need to do, they're very happy to just go back to farming and let us do this stuff.
Yeah, I think specifically navigating the interconnection with the utility is really challenging, and I would tend to defer to a solar company or a solar specialist on that, as well as just navigating that permitting process, with your local jurisdiction or whether it's township or county or state level, different kind of compliance requirements get really muddy really fast.
Yeah,
So yeah, I've had the same experience. It sounds like a great idea on paper, but once you dig in another layer, it can be
yeah.
challenging.
That's usually where we end up at. You raise a good point. I think there are certainly are farmers who want to do a little bit of legwork before they even talk to me or Angie. They want to find out what the permit process is and if they can get a permit, or maybe they want to pay somebody to do a preliminary design, or they do want to go down the interconnection road. Um, we've certainly walked into stuff like that where our farmers know exactly what's going to happen and how to do it, and that's great. So they do kind of like the legwork up front. It certainly adds value to the project, adds value to them. Literally economically, it's a fee for services in addition to any kind of value that we can add to them from a lease payment perspective because we save money on that part of the project that we would otherwise have to pay for. So if you have the time and the means, I certainly recommend you going out and kind of doing what you can on your own, like surface checks, and see if you can move the project along and you can answer some questions that we would have out of the gate. You're certainly gonna help yourself. Like if you happen to be near a substation and you know that, right? Because you've probably been not your door's been knocked on once or twice. So and if you wait, what that interconnection process is like and what the available capacity is on that substation, it's not glamorous work, but you can certainly do it. And having that data set when you're talking to developers would be really, really helpful for you in understanding what they're trying to do, their pain points in trying to do that. And then, you have some sort of, square one control over the project that's happening on your site. So if you can do that, I highly recommend it.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone who's been sending these great questions into the chat. We'll have Angie and Mike give us their parting thoughts. So maybe you could, share some advice, whether you think, what a producer should do first step if they're interested in getting involved, or maybe it's something, legislatively that needs to happen. What do you think needs to happen to move this needle further? Um, and we'll round it off there.
Um, I think actually my best advice for whether it's landowners or farmers or you're both of those, is to be patient. That these solar timelines can be unknown and can be, I think, a lot longer than any of us want them to be, quite frankly. So I personally am guilty of this. I'm so excited about grazing and cropping and beekeeping on our sites, but these projects don't come to fruition overnight. These are long time frames, months and months. It can be 2 to 3 years in many cases. So I think being patient and kind of holding on for the long haul to get through till that site is built is really key. And just keeping that communication and collaboration just really top of mind because this is a long process and a long relationship that we're building together.
Yeah, I second that. And regarding legislation, I actually was going to mention, I do think that that's a really good place to start. And I mentioned earlier, like just the difference of scale between Polk County and the entire state of Massachusetts. I mean, I would imagine that your local representatives are accessible on the county level. Can you get some sort of county program that allows for this? Can you like so what we're doing in Connecticut is we're requesting a redistribution of funds that are in a program that is not used. So without going to the taxpayer and asking for more money, would you consider redistributing that capital to this program? That might be the case at your county level. And hearing it from a farmer rather than a developer is really powerful. So I think that if there is a path to that, local legislation can really help. Like we were just talking about the different designs and the amount of steel and the all this costs money, right? And so if you want to make it work for the developer and you want to make it work for the farmer, you often need a public-private partnership. So if you have connections at your local county, and you think that there's a way that they could contribute some dollars to a local agrivoltaic project that's better for the community and keeps farmers farming in its community, that's probably a great place to start, and I would imagine that would be pretty well received.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angie and Mike, for sharing your background, your approaches to agrivoltaics, and your insights into these relationships. I've learned a lot, and I really hope our audience has as well. Again, thank you, audience, for your many questions. We do have our next webinar in August on the 25th, where Dr. Brad Hines will be sharing research updates from Minnesota. I've been mentioning that we have research projects happening here, as well as Dr. Jordan Macknick from the they changed their name, National Laboratory of the Rockies, I believe.
Wow.
So they have had many agrivoltaic projects throughout the years, and we'll hear some summaries of those. But again, thank you, everybody, and have a good night. Did you have any last thoughts, Angie or Mike?
No, thank you for having us. This was great, Sabrina. Thank you so much. Hope it was
All
helpful.
right. Yeah, thank you all.
Wow. Good evening, everyone.